The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground at Fort Harrison, painting the assembled crowd in shades of gold and amber. Crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and polished brass, while hundreds of soldiers stood in perfect formation, their dress blues immaculate under the watchful eye of tradition. Today was meant to be a celebration, a retirement ceremony honoring Colonel James Peterson, a distinguished officer whose 30 years of service had taken him from the dusty roads of Afghanistan to the corridors of the Pentagon, on the sidelines, away from the rigid lines of ceremony. Captain David Miller adjusted his dress uniform and glanced down at his companion Rex, a German shepherd whose dark muzzle had grown silver with age, sat with the patient dignity of a dog who had seen more battles than most soldiers. His amber eyes, still sharp despite his 12 years, surveyed the gathering with the quiet intensity that had once made him legendary among the military working dog units. "Easy, boy," Miller whispered, running his hand through Rex's thick coat. "Just here to watch today." "No work for either of us." Rex's ears twitched at his handler's voice, but his gaze remained fixed on the ceremony. 3 years had passed since their retirement. 3 years since Rex had officially hung up his service harness after a distinguished career that included 2 Bronze Stars and countless lives saved. The dog's joints might ache on cold mornings now, and his hearing wasn't quite what it used to be, but Miller knew that beneath that greying exterior beat the heart of a warrior who would never truly retire. The base commander stepped to the podium, his voice carrying across the field through strategically placed speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we gather today not just to honor Colonel Peterson's remarkable service, but to celebrate the values that define our military family: honor, courage, and unwavering dedication to duty." Miller felt a swell of pride. As he watched the ceremony unfold, these rituals mattered. They connected the past to the present, reminded everyone why they served. He remembered his own retirement ceremony, much smaller but no less meaningful, where Rex had stood beside him as they both stepped away from active duty. The dog had been his partner for 8 years, through 3 deployments and countless missions that remained classified to this day. A flutter of movement caught Miller's attention as a convoy of black sedans approached the parade ground. The honor guards snapped to even sharper attention as the vehicles disgorged their passengers. High-ranking officials from the Pentagon, dignitaries, and members of Congress who had come to pay their respects to a career soldier among them emerged General Marcus Caldwell, his chest heavy with ribbons and decorations that spoke of a career spanning decades and continents. General Caldwell was a living legend, the kind of officer whose very presence commanded respect. His reputation had been forged in the crucible of modern warfare, leading operations that had shaped the geopolitical landscape of the past 2 decades. Miller had never served directly under Caldwell, but he knew the stories. Everyone did. The general's tactical brilliance had saved countless American lives, and his dedication to his soldiers was the stuff of military folklore. As Caldwell approached the podium to deliver the keynote address, the crowd seemed to lean forward collectively. This was an honor rarely bestowed. Having a 4-star general speak at a colonel's retirement ceremony spoke volumes about Peterson's character and service. The general's polished shoes clicked against the wooden platform as he took his place, his bearing erect and commanding. Despite his 60-plus years, it was then that Miller felt Rex tense beside him. The change was subtle at first, just a slight shift in the dog's posture, the kind of adjustment another observer might attribute to an old dog settling into a more comfortable position. But Miller knew Rex better than he knew most humans. The dog's breathing had changed, becoming more focused, more deliberate. His nostrils flared slightly as he tested the air, and those amber eyes had locked onto something with laser-like intensity. General Caldwell began his speech, his voice resonating with authority and warmth. Colonel Peterson represents the very best of our military tradition. His service has been marked not just by professional excellence, but by the kind of character that inspires those around him to reach beyond themselves, to embody the values that make our armed forces the finest in the world. The crowd hung on every word, but Miller found his attention divided between the general's eloquent tribute and his dog's increasingly agitated behavior. Rex's body had gone rigid, every muscle coiled with tension. His head was cocked at that particular angle Miller recognized, the hunting position, the stance Rex took when his exceptional nose had detected something that demanded investigation. Miller's hand instinctively moved to Rex's neck fingers, finding the spot behind his ears that usually calmed the dog, but Rex didn't relax. If anything, he seemed to grow more, focused, his gaze fixed unwaveringly on General Caldwell. Specifically, Miller realized with growing unease, Rex was staring at the general's feet. "What is it, boy?" Miller whispered, keeping his voice low enough that nearby spectators wouldn't hear Rex's. Ears swiveled toward his handler, for just a moment acknowledging the question, but his attention immediately returned to the general. The ceremony continued around them, but Miller felt a cold finger of dread tracing down his spine. In all their years, together through firefights and patrols, bomb searches and crowd control, Rex had never shown interest in anything without cause. The dog's nose was legendary, capable of detecting explosives in concentrations so minute that electronic equipment would miss them. More importantly, Rex's judgment had never failed, not once, as General Caldwell's speech reached its crescendo, describing the sacred trust between soldiers and the unbreakable bonds forged in service. Rex let out the softest of whines, barely audible, but to Miller's trained ear, it might as well have been a shout. The dog's muscles were trembling now with the effort of restraining himself, of maintaining the discipline that had been drilled into him during his training years ago. Miller felt the weight of eyes on them as a few nearby spectators began to notice the dog's agitation. A major standing to their left cast a curious glance in their direction, while a sergeant's wife leaned over to whisper something to her husband. The ripple of awareness was small but growing, and Miller found himself caught between military protocol, which demanded he remove any disruption to the ceremony, and an unshakable faith in his partner's instincts. The honor guard stood at perfect attention, rifles gleaming in the morning sun, as General Caldwell concluded his remarks to thunderous applause. But even as the crowd erupted in appreciation, Miller watched his dog's behavior with growing alarm. Rex was no longer content to simply observe. The German shepherd shifted his weight forward, his body language screaming that he wanted to move, to investigate, to follow wherever his nose was leading him. And that trail led directly to General Marcus Caldwell. Rex remembered everything: the acrid smell of cordite mixed with desert dust, the weight of his tactical vest heavy with water and equipment as he padded alongside Miller through the narrow streets of Fallujah. The sound of his handlers breathing steady and controlled as they approached a suspected IED site, the moment when his nose caught that telltale chemical signature that meant death was hiding somewhere close, waiting to claim American lives. Those memories lived in his muscles, in the very fiber of his being. A dog's sense of smell was not just a tool, it was a language, a way of reading the world that humans could barely comprehend. Where people saw objects and surfaces, Rex experienced layers of scent that told stories spanning days, weeks, sometimes months. Every person who had touched an object left their mark. Every substance that had come into contact with it contributed to its unique olfactory signature. And right now, sitting on the parade ground at Fort Harrison, Rex was reading a story that made his blood run cold. The scent coming from General Caldwell's direction wasn't just one thing. It was a complex symphony of odors that triggered memories Rex wished he could forget. There was leather, expensive and well-maintained, the kind used in ceremonial military footwear. There was polish, the standard black shine that regulations demanded, but beneath those expected aromas lay. Something else, something that activated neural pathways burned into Rex's brain through years of life-or-death training. It was the smell of C4 plastic explosive. Not fresh. C4. Rex's nose was too sophisticated to be fooled by that. This was residue. The ghostly chemical traces that clung to materials long after direct contact had ended. But it was definitely there, mixed with other scents that painted an even more troubling picture. Cordite, the metallic tang of ammunition primers, and something else that Rex associated with the hidden weapons caches they had discovered during their tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. The German shepherd's training took over, overriding the arthritis in his joints and the grey in his muzzle. His body coiled into the alert position that had once meant the difference between life and death for the soldiers under his protection. Every instinct screamed at him to investigate, to alert his handler, to do his job. Captain Miller felt the change immediately. After 8 years as partners, he could read Rex's body language like a book written in his native tongue. The dog's posture, the set of his ears, the particular way his tail held rigid, all of it spelled out a clear message that made Miller's stomach clench with recognition. Rex had found something. "Easy boy," Miller whispered again, but his voice carried less conviction now. His mind was racing, trying to process what his dog's behavior might mean. This was a military ceremony surrounded by security, with some of the highest-ranking officials in the armed forces in attendance. The idea that Rex could be alerting on anything dangerous seemed impossible, but impossible or not, Miller knew his dog. Rex didn't make mistakes. The general's speech was, winding down his voice, carrying across the field with practiced ease. As Colonel Peterson begins this new chapter of his life, he takes with him not just our gratitude, but our absolute confidence that his service to this great nation will continue, in whatever form it may take. Thank you, Colonel, for your dedication, your sacrifice, and your unwavering commitment to the values that make America strong. The crowd erupted in applause, hundreds of hands coming together in appreciation. But through the noise, Miller heard something that made his blood run cold. Rex had begun to emit a low, nearly inaudible growl. It was the sound the dog made when he had pinpointed a target, when he was certain beyond doubt that his nose had led him to something significant. Several people in their immediate vicinity were beginning to notice now. A young lieutenant's wife pointed discreetly in their direction, whispering to her husband. A retired sergeant major, his chest heavy with service ribbons, was studying Rex with the trained eye of someone who knew military working dogs. The circle of awareness was expanding, and Miller knew he had to make a decision. Protocol demanded that he remove Rex from the ceremony if the dog was creating a disturbance. Military discipline required absolute respect for the solemnity of such occasions. But protocol and discipline had never meant more to Miller than the lives of his fellow soldiers, and Rex's track record for finding threats was flawless. As General Caldwell stepped down from the podium, accepting congratulations from the base commander and other dignitaries, Rex began to move. The movement was subtle, just a slight shift forward, his powerful shoulders bunching as he prepared to rise. But Miller caught it immediately. "Stay," he commanded quietly, using the firm tone that had been drilled into both of them during their training. Rex's ears flicked toward his handler, acknowledging the command, but the dog's focus never wavered from the general. If anything, his agitation seemed to be increasing as Caldwell moved closer to their section of the crowd. Miller's mind flashed back to their last deployment, together to a day when Rex's nose had saved an entire convoy from an IED that intelligence had somehow missed. The dog had alerted 50 meters before they would have reached the trigger point. his behavior exactly like what Miller was seeing now. That day, Rex's instincts had meant the difference between a successful patrol and a catastrophic loss of life. The memory crystallized Miller's resolve. Whatever was happening here, whatever Rex was detecting, it needed to be investigated. The dog's nose had never lied to him before, and Miller wasn't about to start doubting it. Now, General Caldwell was. Making his way through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging brief words with the assembled soldiers and their families. His path would bring him within 20 feet of where Miller and Rex were positioned, and the German shepherd's agitation was becoming more pronounced with each step. The general took in their direction. Miller made his decision. Rising from his position, he placed a gentle but firm hand on Rex's collar and began to move toward the general's path. He wasn't sure what he was going to say or do when he reached Caldwell, but 30 years of military service had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now his instincts were screaming that his dog had detected something that could change everything about this ceremony. Rex fell into step beside him, the old training asserting itself despite his retirement. The dog's behavior was controlled but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read the signs. His nose was up, testing the air with each breath, his body language radiating the controlled tension of a predator closing in on its prey. As they approached General Caldwell's position, Miller caught sight of the man's ceremonial shoes, polished to a mirror finish, adorned with the kind of subtle detailing that spoke of custom craftsmanship and considerable expense. They were beautiful pieces of military bearing, exactly what one would expect a four-star general to wear to such an important ceremony. Rex's growl deepened, still barely audible, but unmistakably. In present, the German shepherd's amber eyes were locked on those polished shoes with an intensity that made Miller's pulse quicken. Whatever his dog was detecting its source was definitely connected to General Marcus Caldwell's footwear, and that realization opened up possibilities that made Captain David Miller's blood run cold. The murmur started as a ripple spreading outward from the small cluster of people who had noticed Rex's increasingly agitated behavior. Military ceremonies were precisely choreographed. Affairs where even the smallest deviation from protocol drew attention, and the sight of a visibly distressed German shepherd was becoming impossible to ignore. "Is that dog all right?" whispered Mrs. Henderson, the base commander's wife, leaning toward. Her husband, with concern, etched across her features. Colonel Henderson followed her gaze to where Captain Miller was attempting to maintain control over his clearly agitated companion. The base commander had served long enough to recognize the signs of a military working dog in alert mode, and what he was seeing made his stomach tighten with unease. "That's Rex," Henderson murmured back to his wife, his voice carrying the weight of recognition. "Retired K9 from the explosive detection unit. If that dog is alerting, there's a reason." The whisper of recognition spread like wildfire through the crowd of military personnel. Rex's reputation had preceded him into retirement. There wasn't a soldier on the base who hadn't heard stories of the German shepherd's legendary nose, his uncanny ability to detect threats that electronic equipment missed. The dog had saved countless lives during his years of active service, and his presence at military gatherings was usually a source of pride rather than concern. But this was different. General Caldwell, still moving through the crowd, accepting congratulations, seemed unaware of the growing attention focused on Miller and his dog. The four-star general's demeanor remained exactly what one would expect. Gracious, dignified, carrying himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Yet something in his expression flickered when his eyes briefly met Miller's across the intervening space. It was barely perceptible, lasting perhaps A fraction of a second, slight tightening around the eyes, a momentary pause in his stride. Most observers would have missed it entirely, but Miller's years of reading people in high-stress situations caught the tell. General Caldwell had noticed. Rex's behavior and his reaction suggested recognition rather than confusion. Miller felt his pulse quicken as fragments of memory began to coalesce in his mind. The classified mission 3 years ago, just before his and Rex's retirement. The intelligence. Reports about black market weapons being smuggled out of Afghanistan through military channels. The investigation that had gone cold when their primary suspect, a high-ranking official whose identity had been heavily redacted in the reports Miller had been allowed to see, had been transferred to a posting in Washington. Rex's growl intensified slightly as General Caldwell's path brought him closer to their position. The dog's training was evident in his restraint, years of discipline keeping him from lunging forward to investigate the source of the scents that were driving his instincts wild, but that restraint was clearly being tested to its limits. Captain Miller. The voice belonged to Major Sarah Chen, the base's head of security. She had approached from the side, her movement casual enough not to draw additional attention, but purposeful enough to make her intent clear. "Is there a problem with your dog?" Miller found himself at a crossroads. Protocol demanded that he apologize for the disruption and remove Rex from the ceremony immediately. But protocol hadn't saved the lives of the soldiers who had died in that IED attack 3 years ago, the one where the explosives had been traced to a cache that should have been secure, should have been under military control. Major Miller said carefully, his voice low enough that nearby civilians wouldn't overhear. Rex is exhibiting classic, alert behavior. He's detected something that's triggered his training protocols. Chen's expression shifted, the casual concern replaced by sharp professional focus. She had worked with military working dogs during her own deployment years, and Miller's words carried implications that made her hand instinctively move toward the radio on her belt-alert behavior. She repeated, her eyes moving between Miller and Rex, then tracking toward General Caldwell's position. "What kind of alert?" "Explosive residue," Miller said quietly, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. "That's his specialty, and he's never been wrong." The color drained from Chen's face. She was responsible for security at this event, and the idea that a retired K9 was detecting explosive residue in proximity to a 4-star general and hundreds of military personnel was the stuff of nightmares. Her training kicked in, running through threat assessment protocols, even as her mind reeled with the implications. "Are you absolutely certain?" she asked, her voice tight with controlled tension. Miller looked down at Rex, who was now straining against his informal leash, every muscle in his aging body focused on General Caldwell's approaching figure. The dog's behavior was textbook, exactly the same as it had been during their active service when he had detected hidden explosives or weapons caches. There was no ambiguity, no room for doubt. "I've never seen him alert when there wasn't something to find," Miller replied, his own voice growing. "And tighter, and right now he's telling me that General Caldwell is connected to whatever he's detecting." The implications of that statement hung in the air between them like a live grenade. Major Chen was facing a decision that could end her career, regardless of which choice she made. If she acted on Miller's assessment and found nothing, she would face charges of creating a false alarm and embarrassing one of the military's most respected leaders. If she ignored it and something catastrophic happened, the consequences would be far worse. General Caldwell had noticed their conversation. His path through the crowd had slowed, and his attention was now clearly focused on the small group surrounding Rex. The expression on his face had shifted from genial public engagement to something harder, more calculating. When their eyes met again, Miller saw something in the general's gaze that made his blood run cold. It was the look of a man who knew he had been discovered, Captain Miller Caldwell's. Voice carried across the remaining distance between them, pitched to sound casual, but loaded with authority. "I see you've brought a friend to the ceremony. That's the famous Rex, isn't it?" The question was ostensibly friendly, but Miller caught the undertone of something else. Was it concern, fear? The general was moving toward them now, with apparent casualness, but his body language had shifted subtly. Where moments before he had been relaxed and open now, there was a tension in his shoulders, a calculation in his movements. Rex's response was immediate and unmistakable. The German shepherd's growl deepened to a rumble that was clearly audible to anyone within 15 feet. His body coiled into the attack position that Miller had seen countless times during their active service, not aggressive, but prepared, every sense focused on the approaching figure. "Yes," Sir Miller replied, his military training keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "He seems to have taken an interest in something." The crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing the tension, even if they didn't understand its source. Conversations died as people turned to watch the interaction between the decorated general and the retired canine handler. The ceremony's festive atmosphere was evaporating, replaced by something that felt dangerous and unpredictable. General Caldwell stopped about 10 feet away from Miller and Rex, close enough for conversation, but far enough to maintain what might have been a defensive distance. His smile remained in place, but it no longer reached his eyes. "Military working dogs can be unpredictable in retirement," he said, his tone carrying the weight of authority. "Perhaps it would be best if you removed him from the ceremony before he causes any further disruption." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. But Miller found himself thinking of the soldiers who had died 3 years ago, of the investigation that had been quietly shelved, of the nagging sense that justice had been denied. Rex made the decision for him. The German shepherd suddenly lunged forward, not aggressively, but with the focused determination of a dog following, his nose to its source. His movement was so sudden that Miller's grip on his collar nearly slipped, and it took all of the captain's strength to maintain control. The dog was reaching toward General Caldwell's feet, his nose working frantically as he tried to get closer to the source of whatever scent had triggered his alert behavior. The general stepped back quickly, his composure finally cracking enough to show real alarm. "Get that animal under control." Caldwell snapped, his voice carrying across the crowd and drawing even more attention to their confrontation. But Major Chen had seen enough. Rex's behavior, combined with Miller's assessment and the general's increasingly defensive reactions, had triggered her own instincts. Her hand moved to her radio, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone prepared to face whatever consequences might follow. "Security team to the parade ground, code yellow. I need explosive detection personnel on site immediately." The announcement sent shockwaves through the crowd. Code yellow meant a potential threat requiring investigation, and the mention of explosive detection sent ripples of alarm through the assembled military personnel and their families. General Caldwell's face went white as the implications became clear. His own behavior had now made him the focus of a security investigation at a ceremony where he was supposed to be the guest of honor. "This is outrageous," he protested, his voice rising. "I will not be subjected to this kind of treatment based on the behavior of an old dog." But Rex wasn't finished. As security personnel began moving toward their position, the German shepherd managed to break free from Miller's grip with the speed and determination that had made him legendary during his active service. Rex moved directly toward General Caldwell, his nose focused on the man's ceremonial shoes with laser-like intensity. What happened next would change everything about this ceremony and about the reputation of one of the military's most decorated leaders. The security team descended on the parade ground with the swift efficiency that characterized military response protocols. Within minutes, the festive atmosphere of Colonel Peterson's retirement ceremony had transformed into something resembling a crime scene investigation. Personnel were cordoned off, communication channels were secured, and the carefully planned celebration had given way to barely controlled chaos. Rex sat in perfect position beside General Caldwell's feet, his nose pointed directly at the man's polished ceremonial shoes. The dog's training had taken over completely now, his body rigid with the focused intensity that had once saved lives in war zones across the globe. Every instinct, every hour of conditioning, every successful detection from his 8 years of active service had converged on this moment. "Sir, I need you to step away from the dog and allow our team to conduct an examination." Major Chen said, her voice carrying the weight of military authority despite addressing one of the most senior officers in the armed forces. The decision to treat General Caldwell as a potential security threat was one that could end her career. But Rex's behavior had left her no choice. General Caldwell's composure was fracturing visibly now. The genial mask that had characterized his public persona was slipping, replaced by something harder and more desperate. "This is absolutely preposterous. I will not be subjected to this humiliation based on the delusions of a retired animal." But his protests only served to draw more attention to the scene. The crowd of military personnel, their families and visiting dignitaries watched with growing alarm as security specialists approached with detection equipment. This wasn't how retirement ceremonies were supposed to unfold, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, the base's senior explosive detection specialist, approached with her own German Shepherd, a young male named Thor, whose training represented the latest advances in military working dog protocols. The interaction between the two dogs was immediate and telling. Thor's behavior began mirroring Rex's the moment he came within scenting distance of General Caldwell. Ma'am Walsh reported to Major Chen, her voice tight with professional concern. "Thor is exhibiting classic alert behavior consistent with explosive residue detection. Whatever Rex found, we're getting the same indicators." The confirmation sent shockwaves through the assembled security team. Two independent working dogs with no opportunity for cross-contamination or behavioral cueing were providing identical alerts on the same target. In the world of explosive detection, such concordance was virtually indisputable evidence that something was present. General Caldwell's face had gone ashen. His eyes darted between the two dogs, the security personnel, and the growing crowd of observers. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of barely controlled panic. "I demand to speak with my attorney. This entire proceeding is in violation of my rights as a commissioned officer. I will not—" Sir Major Chen interrupted her own training, overriding any deference to rank. "We need to examine your footwear immediately. The dogs are providing consistent alerts that indicate potential security threats. This is not optional." The standoff stretched for a moment that felt like an eternity. General Caldwell stood frozen, surrounded by security personnel, and watched by hundreds of witnesses, his decorated career hanging in the balance. Rex remained motionless beside him, every fiber of the dog's being focused on the ceremonial shoes that had triggered this crisis. Finally, perhaps recognizing that resistance would only make his situation worse, Caldwell slowly bent down and began removing his shoes. His hands shook slightly as he worked, and Captain Miller noticed that the general's breathing had become shallow and rapid, classic signs of acute stress response. The shoes were beautiful pieces of craftsmanship, clearly custom-made for the ceremony. The leather was flawless, the polish mirror-bright, the brass fittings gleaming in the afternoon sun. They looked exactly like what they were supposed to be, the ceremonial footwear of a distinguished military officer, but appearances, as Rex had demonstrated, could be deceiving. Staff Sergeant Walsh accepted the shoes with gloved hands, her own dog Thor immediately moving to examine them. The younger German shepherd's behavior was unambiguous. He sat in the perfect alert position, nose pointed directly at the shoe's tail, rigid with concentration. Rex, meanwhile, had relaxed slightly, now that the source of his concern was separated from General Caldwell, but his eyes remained fixed on the footwear with unwavering intensity. "I need a private area for examination," Walsh reported. "And I'll need the full explosive detection kit." Major Chen nodded, gesturing toward a nearby administrative. "Building conference room B is secure and private. Take whatever personnel and equipment you need." As the examination team prepared to move, General Caldwell made one final desperate protest. "This is career suicide for all of you. When this ridiculous charade is over, I'll make sure every person involved faces court-martial proceedings. You're destroying the careers of dedicated soldiers based on the behavior of animals." But his threats carried less weight now. The man standing before them, in his stocking feet, his carefully constructed public persona crumbling under the pressure of investigation, no longer projected the authority and confidence that had defined his public image. He looked, Miller thought, like exactly what Rex's nose was telling them he was. A man with something to hide. The examination took 45 minutes that felt like hours to the assembled crowd. Military personnel who had come to celebrate a colleague's retirement found themselves witnesses to what was rapidly becoming the biggest scandal in the base's recent history. Whispered conversations rippled through the gathering as people speculated about what the dogs might have found, what it might mean for General Caldwell's career, and how a simple retirement ceremony had transformed into a criminal investigation. When Staff Sergeant Walsh finally emerged from the administrative building, her expression was grim. She carried an evidence bag containing something small, and her body language told the story before she spoke a word. "Major Chen," she reported, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent parade ground. "We found concealed compartments in both shoes, sealed with military-grade adhesive compounds. The compartments contained approximately 50 carats of uncut diamonds, along with residue consistent with C4 plastic explosive and traces of Middle Eastern soil samples." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs, but Walsh wasn't finished. "Additionally, we found documentation suggesting these diamonds originated from conflict zones in Afghanistan, along with what appears to be a coded list of military personnel and their deployment schedules. This appears to be evidence of black market trafficking using military resources and personnel general." Caldwell's legs seemed to give out beneath him. He collapsed into a nearby chair, his face buried in his hands, the last vestiges of his dignity evaporating under the weight of evidence that Rex's nose had uncovered. Captain Miller knelt beside his old partner, running his hands through the German shepherd's graying fur. Rex leaned into the familiar touch, his tail wagging slightly for the first time since the ceremony had begun. The dog's work was done. He had detected the threat, alerted his handler, and allowed the human authorities to take over. "Good boy, Miller," whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You did good, Rex. You did real good." As military police moved to take General Caldwell into custody, Miller found himself thinking about the soldiers who had died 3 years ago, about the investigation that had been shelved, about the justice that had finally been served by a retired dog whose only motivation was the desire to do his job. Rex had saved lives again, even in retirement. And this time he had saved something even more precious, the integrity of the military institution they had both served with honor. The arrest of General Marcus Caldwell sent shockwaves far beyond the boundaries of Fort Harrison. Within hours, news crews had descended on the base, drawn by reports of a decorated 4-star general being taken into custody on charges related to black market diamond trafficking and potential treason. The story had all the elements that made headlines: corruption, In high places, international intrigue, and perhaps most compelling of all, the retired military dog whose nose had unraveled it all. But for Captain David Miller, the media circus felt secondary to the quiet moment he was sharing with Rex in the base. Veterinary clinic, the German Shepherd lay on the examination table panting slightly from the stress of the day's events, while the base veterinarian conducted a routine health check, prompted by the dog's sudden return to active detection work. His vitals are strong. Dr. Sarah Martinez reported, running her hands along Rex's flanks with the practiced touch of someone who had treated hundreds of military working dogs. A little elevated heart rate, which is understandable given the circumstances, but nothing concerning. This old soldier still has plenty of fight in him. Miller smiled, scratching behind Rex's ears, in the spot that had always been the dog's favorite. He's always been tougher than he looks. Even at 12, he's got the heart of a warrior. The veterinarian nodded, making notes in Rex's medical file. The explosive detection unit wants to know if you'd consider bringing him in for some consultation work. Apparently, his behavior today was textbook perfect, better than some of their active duty dogs. They could use his expertise in training scenarios. The suggestion made Miller's chest swell with pride. Even in retirement, Rex was being recognized for his exceptional abilities. But as he looked into his old partner's amber eyes, he saw something else, a satisfaction, a sense of completion that hadn't been there in the 3 years since their joint retirement. Rex had needed this. The dog had spent his entire adult life serving, protecting, detecting threats, and saving lives. Retirement had been kind to him, but it had also left him without purpose, without the mission that had defined his existence. Today had reminded both of them why they had been partners, why their bond had been forged in the crucible of shared service. A knock on the clinic door interrupted Miller's reflections. Major Chen entered her expression, carrying a mixture of exhaustion and professional satisfaction. The security chief had spent the afternoon coordinating with federal investigators, military police, and base command as they worked to understand the full scope of Caldwell's alleged crimes. "Captain," she said, nodding respectfully to Miller before turning her attention to Rex, "I wanted to thank both of you personally. Your dog may have prevented a security breach that could have compromised ongoing operations across multiple theaters." Miller raised an eyebrow. "Multiple theaters." Chen's expression grew more serious. "The investigation is ongoing, but preliminary analysis suggests that General Caldwell was using his position to facilitate black market trades involving conflict diamonds, weapons, and potentially classified information." The list found in his shoes contained the names and deployment schedules of special operations personnel across Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. The implications hit Miller like a physical blow. Rex hadn't just detected evidence of past crimes. He had potentially prevented future ones. The information hidden in Caldwell's shoes could have been used to compromise active missions, to target American soldiers in hostile territories, to turn military intelligence into profit for those willing to betray their oaths. "How long?" Miller asked quietly. "We're still piecing that together," Chen replied. "But based on what we've found so far, possibly years. The diamonds appear to be from various Afghan mining operations, and some of the documentation suggests a network that may have been operating since at least 2018. Rex lifted his head, sensing the change in the human's emotional state. The dog's amber eyes moved between Miller and Chen, reading their body language with the same precision he had used to detect threats during his active service. Whatever they were discussing was important, and Rex's protective instincts remained as sharp as ever. Dr. Martinez finished her examination, updating Rex's file with the day's events. "He's cleared for light or duty if needed," she reported, "though at his age I'd recommend keeping any future work sessions brief and low stress." Miller chuckled, running his hand along Rex's back. "Doc, I don't think Rex understands the concept of low stress anymore. He's been bored, out of his mind for 3 years. As if to prove the point, Rex's tail began wagging at the mention of future work. The dog might be 12 years old with graying fur and creaking joints, but his enthusiasm for the job remained undimmed. The clinic door opened again, admitting Colonel Henderson, the base commander, whose normally composed demeanor showed signs of the day's extraordinary stress. Behind him came an unexpected visitor, Colonel James Peterson, the man whose retirement ceremony had been transformed into a criminal investigation. Captain Miller Henderson said, his voice carrying the weight of command mixed with genuine gratitude. "I wanted to speak with you and Rex personally, before the media gets hold of this story." Peterson stepped forward, his eyes moving between Miller and the German Shepherd on the examination table. "That dog saved more than just my retirement ceremony," he said quietly. "The investigation team thinks Caldwell was planning to use today's gathering to pass intelligence to a contact. If Rex hadn't detected those diamonds, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood the implications. A routine military ceremony had been chosen as cover for what might have been a massive security breach, and only Rex's exceptional nose had prevented it from succeeding. There's going to be a formal investigation, of course. Henderson continued. Congressional hearings. Inspector General reviews the works. But I wanted you to know that your actions today, both of yours, represent the very best of military service. You trusted your partner's instincts, even when it meant challenging one of the highest-ranking officers in the armed forces. Miller felt his throat tighten with emotion. Rex did. "All the work, sir. I just listened to what he was telling me." "That's exactly what makes you both heroes," Peterson replied. "The courage to trust, even when the stakes are impossibly high." Rex, perhaps sensing that he was the subject of the conversation, lifted his head with quiet dignity. His amber eyes surveyed the assembled humans with the calm authority of a dog who had served with distinction and knew his worth. The tail wagging had stopped, replaced by the alert posture that had once commanded. Respect in war zones across the globe. Dr. Martinez cleared her throat, bringing the group's attention back to practical matters. "If you're planning any kind of recognition ceremony, I'd recommend keeping it brief. Rex has had enough excitement for one day, and at his age, too much stimulation can be taxing." Colonel Henderson nodded. "Actually, that's part of why we're here. The Pentagon wants to present Rex with a special commendation, something unprecedented for a retired military working dog. They're calling it the Distinguished Service Medal for exceptional valor in retirement." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Military decorations for active duty working dogs were rare enough. A medal specifically created for a retired dog's actions was virtually unheard of. It represented not just recognition of Rex's individual achievement, but acknowledgement of the vital role that military working dogs played in national security. "When?" Miller asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Next week," Henderson replied. "Small ceremony, just immediate personnel and some Pentagon officials. Nothing like today's excitement." Major Chen smiled for the first time since the crisis had begun. "I think we can handle security for that event." Without any surprises, as the officials prepared to leave, Colonel Peterson paused at the clinic door. "Captain, there's one more thing. The families of the soldiers who died in that IED attack 3 years ago, the one you mentioned during the investigation, they've asked me to pass along their gratitude. Apparently Rex's work today has given them something they thought they'd never have." "What's that, sir?" "Closure." Peterson replied simply, "They know now that justice has finally been served after the others had gone." Miller found himself alone with Rex and Dr. Martinez. The veterinarian was organizing her equipment, giving the captain and his dog a few moments of privacy to process the day's events. Miller looked into Rex's eyes, seeing reflected there all the missions they had shared, all the lives they had saved, all the bonds forged in the crucible of service. The German shepherd gazed back with the quiet confidence of a job well done, his tail giving a single decisive wag. "You know what, boy?" Miller said, softly scratching behind Rex's ears. "I think we're both ready to come out of retirement." Rex's response was immediate and unmistakable. His tail began wagging with the enthusiasm of a much younger dog, and his amber eyes sparkled with renewed purpose. The old warrior had found his mission again, and nothing in the world could make him happier. Outside the clinic windows, the sun was setting over Fort Harrison, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The base was returning to normal operations, but everyone who had witnessed the day's events would carry the memory of what they had seen, the moment when a retired dog's unwavering dedication to duty had exposed corruption at the highest levels and reminded them all why they served Rex. Jumped down from the examination table with surprising agility, his movement fluid despite his age, he padded over to the window and looked out at the parade ground where it had all unfolded, his nose twitching slightly as he tested the evening. But whatever scents he detected now were clean. No traces of explosives, no hints of deception, no shadows of betrayal, just the honest smells of a military base where good people served their country with honor and integrity. Rex turned back. To Miller, his tail wagging steadily now, his eyes bright with contentment. The German shepherd had done his job, had served his country, had proven once again that loyalty and dedication never truly retire. And in that moment, both dog and handler understood that their story was far from over. There would be other missions, other threats to detect, other lives to save. Rex might be 12 years old with grey in his muzzle, but his heart remained that of the warrior who had never met a challenge he wouldn't face. The ceremony that had begun as a celebration of one man's service had become something far more significant. A reminder that heroism comes in many forms, that justice sometimes has 4 legs and a wet nose, and that the bonds forged in service to others can never truly be broken. As they walked out of the clinic together, Miller's hand resting gently on Rex's neck, both of them knew that their greatest adventures were still ahead of them. The old team was back together, ready to face whatever threats the future might hold. And somewhere in the growing darkness, the enemies of freedom would do well to remember that Rex's nose never forgot a scent, and his dedication to protecting the innocent would never waver. The retired canine who had changed a ceremony would continue changing lives one detection at a time.